Public health in the United States has long put women at a disadvantage, from attributing women's health concerns to hysteria, overusing cocaine and chloroform and subsequently barbiturates to sedate housewives, to denying women the right to control their own bodies. Men have long been responsible for policy decisions surrounding women's health. Today, we're going to be discussing women's access to abortions during the 1960s and 1970s, before and after the historical Roe v. Wade landmark decision.
Uppity Women Unite. We certainly did, didn't we?
Big insight of the women's movement was the personal is political.
Once you stop blaming yourself for all of this, it was like somebody had lifted a rock off of you. And then here were women all around you who were ready to go out there and do something about it.
Abortion has been around for centuries. Whether you believe it should be or not, abortion has been happening for a while. In fact, in the United States in 1821 was America's first statutory abortion regulation. And not to make abortion illegal either. This law was passed in Connecticut to protect mothers from more dangerous abortion methods, usually carried out in later pregnancy. But in 1856, the American Medical Association established a drive to end legal abortion, and when the Comstock Law was passed in 1873, it banned obscene literature and immoral articles, as well as other information about birth control, abortion, sexuality, and STDs. By 1890, abortion was only permitted in cases where the mother's life was in danger, the pregnancy came about due to a rape or incest, or the fetus was deformed. And it took many years past this for someone to question the system. Abortion was illegal, and this was a huge problem. Just because abortion was illegal did not mean that it did not take place, and this is where the problem came in. In 1965, illegal abortions accounted for 17% of all maternal deaths. What's even worse is that these were only the reported cases. There were likely many more deaths than we know, but due to shameful social connotations of the time, many cases were swept under the rug. What may be even more disturbing is that many women attempted a self-induced abortion due to either a lack of access to underground abortion services, the money to afford any such service, or embarrassment when receiving an abortion. According to surveys done in poor New York City neighborhoods in 1965 and 1967, only 2% of respondents' abortion attempts involved a physician. Respondents noted various home methods to provoke an abortion, including turpentine, Clorox, quinine, and uterine insertions. Most notoriously, the metal coat hanger. The 1950s and 1960s were a crucial period in the movement towards the legalization of abortion. During this time, women began to use their voice to talk to each other. In doing so, they began to realize that many of the problems they were dealing with were not unique. Almost every woman could relate to the social, economic, and political ramifications of being a woman. Fed up of their lack of rights and desperate for solutions, women across the country set up women's liberations organizations and took action. On June 30th, 1966, the National Organization for Women was founded, thoughtfully abbreviated NOW. Women wanted solutions. Now! Women were done with sex discrimination and were taking action, and more importantly, making themselves known. Betty Friedan was a representative at the Third National Conference of Commissions on the Status of Women and was frustrated with the application of topics discussed in regards to women's rights. She became inspired after surveying her former college classmates at their 15th reunion. When she found out many of them were unhappy being housewives, she was inspired and wrote The Feminine Mystique. Friedan didn't know it at the time, but the feminine mystique would later help spark the women's movement. In addition to public voices for women's rights, an underground organization called the Jane Collective began from the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. Commonly referred to as Jane, the group began providing illicit abortions in a series of ever-moving housing in Chicago. The group consisted of several women who found themselves in the position to direct women to various abortion providers. Originally, Jane was just a referral service, but soon snowballed into a group of women trained by a local gynecologist on abortion techniques they could perform themselves. There were so many women in need of abortions that the gynecologists that would actually perform the procedure were overwhelmed. It was then that this group of women began providing abortions to other women. Knowledge of the group largely spread through word of mouth in order to keep the service underground. And from 1969 to 1973, it is estimated that the group performed over 11,000 abortions. The efforts of Jane were applaudable, but providing underground abortions is not a long-term solution to minimizing the dangers of illegal and self-induced abortions, especially across a nation. In order for laws to change, the movement had to become public. By this time, there were many consciousness-raising groups such as New York Radical Women, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, also known as WITCH, and Black Women's Liberation Committee, whom had become inspired to make change. With pent-up momentum from the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, and this new college age, women began pouring into the streets. Women from every walk of life, age, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic class. Women protested. Women wrote powerful poetry. Women were the change that the country wanted and so desperately needed. Women of the late 1960s, particularly the organized groups of women speaking out about their lack of access to safe abortions, were the power that changed the cultural perceptions of the legality of abortion. Literature also played a role in shifting attitudes. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was published in 1963 and explored the idea of women finding fulfillment outside of the traditional sexist roles historically accepted. Friedan challenged the belief that, quote, fulfillment as a woman had only one definition for American women after 1949, the housewife mother, end quote. Poets had a lot to say as well. Kate Millett's Sexual Politics piece called out male chauvinism.
There are a vast number of women who are beginning to wake out of the long sleep that is known as cooperation of one's own oppression and self-denigration. And they are banding together to make the beginnings of a new and massive women's movement in America and in the world, to establish true equality between the sexes, to break the old machine of sexual politics and to replace it with a more human and civilized world for both sexes, and to end the present system's oppression of men as well as of women.
Through literature, poetry, and protests, the women's movement was propelled. These human and non-human agents sparked the making of history, and in the process also recorded it. Poets and poetry captured the sentiments and emotions of women of the time, and books like The Feminine Mystique challenged political, economic, and social ideologies that force women into being considered second class, while also thoroughly recording the frustrations of the time. But what happened in other cities? In other countries? A part of the reason that abortion was not well documented before Roe v. Wade or legalization in any country is due to that. It's illegality. Makes sense, right? However, modern historians looking to research and document women's health before Roe v. Wade and other landmark decisions have largely focused on the United States. The 2014 documentary, She's Beautiful When She's Angry, only discusses abortion within the United States. To be fair, the film was made to discuss feminism and its rise within the U.S. However, the documentary never mentions the implications of the U.S.'s decision to legalize abortion. This lack of global perspective surrounding the time period before abortion legalization in countries other than the United States creates a Western-centric conception of whether or not abortion should be legalized and the democratic process behind which the decision did occur. These histories being created today are useful and educational, no doubt. However, our lack of a global perspective in regards to how women in other parts of the world have managed through illegal abortions and potentially managed to legalize abortion limits our ability to conceptualize the past. And this affects our perception of feminism and the women's rights movement today. Let's look at a modern-day example. The women's rights movement in El Salvador is just getting started. When the Zika virus re-emerged in 2013, countries in Latin America were facing a problem. And that problem? Facing the unfortunate birth defects that come along with the Zika virus while operating in government with such conservative birth control laws that limit access to preventative birth control and outlaw abortion under any circumstance. When the virus became even more widespread in 2016, the El Salvadoran government urged women to not get pregnant until 2018, when the virus may have dispersed. The religious nation faced internal conflict upon this proposal. Reducing pregnancy would require extensive use of birth control, and what happens to women who do get pregnant and also acquire Zika during this time? Should they be able to terminate their pregnancies due to the birth defects their child may have? This is where the abortion debate comes in. El Salvador's total ban on abortion has not only prevented women from ending Zika-infected pregnancies, but punished them for having miscarriages, like 19-year-old Evelyn Beatriz Hernandez Cruz in July 2017, who had a miscarriage following a rape. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. None of these issues were documented in She's Beautiful When She's Angry, the US documentary, which may have helped spread a global movement that would have changed the fate of others like Evelyn Cruz. Specifically, with the historically praised Western view, largely due to racial and ethnic biases, which further contribute to women's health-related concerns not being listened to, has disproportionately affected women of color, like those living in El Salvador. What's important to remember is that women's movements are still happening. They haven't ended. The vision of women's movements must not end with that of the one in the US in the 1960s and 1970s. We must focus on these movements and document them, especially so we can learn from our past mistakes. The United States did not host the one and only women's movement that solved the world's problems. But it may be used to evaluate how to advance women's rights in other countries. Women's healthcare has long been controlled by men and disadvantaged because of the sexist and chauvinistic biases that cultural society developed towards women's health complaints and standards of care. As a society, we must pay attention to what reform methods worked and did not work in the past in order to create a more gender and healthcare inclusive society today for tomorrow.